So I can't really hold up the books I'm reviewing in this video because there's 16 of them and I would drop them and it would go badly. So instead, I'm holding a cat who's probably not going to stick around for long. But we'll see.
Stop thinking of what you intend to do. Stop thinking of what you have just done. Then stop thinking that you have stopped thinking of those things. Then you will find the now, the time that stretches eternal, and is really the only time there is. He shook his head pityingly. This, more than anything else, is what I have never understood about your people. You can roll dice and understand that the whole game may hinge on one turn of a die. You deal out cards and say that for all a man's fortune, for the knight may turn upon one hand, but a man's whole life you sniff at and say, what? This knot of a human, this fisherman, this carpenter, this thief, this cook. Why, what can they do in the great wide world? And so you putter and sputter your lives away like candles burning in a draft. Everyone thinks that courage is about facing death without flinching, but almost anyone can do that. Almost anyone can hold their breath and not scream for as long as it takes to die. True courage is about facing life without flinching. I don't mean the times when the right path is hard, but glorious at the end. I'm talking about enduring the boredom, the messiness, and the inconvenience of doing what is right. Leave off sniffing the carcass of your old life. Do you enjoy unending pain? There's no shame in walking away from bones, nor is there any special wisdom in injuring oneself over and over. What is your loyalty to that pain? To abandon it will not lessen you. Axe bit wood into pieces, and hammers nailed it back together. Humans could never accept the world as it was and live in it. They were always breaking it and living among the shattered pieces. There is no path to the future, Fitz. The path is now. Now is all there is, or ever will be. You can change perhaps the next 10 breaths in your life, but after that, random chance seizes you in its jaws again. A tree falls on you, a spider bites your ankle, and all your grand plans for winning a battle are for naught. Now is what we have, Fitz, and now is where we act to stay alive. Never do what you cannot undo until you've considered what you cannot do once you've done it. There are endings, there are beginnings. Sometimes they coincide, with the ending of one thing marking the beginning of another. But sometimes there is simply a long space after an ending, a time when it seems everything else has ended, and nothing else can ever begin.
So, I have a lot of ground to cover for this video. The goal is for it to be under an hour. We have What Is It About, where I'm really only going to talk about what Farseer and Liveship is generally about, and I'm going to go over that pretty quickly. Because obviously I can't talk about what like Tawny Man or Fitz and the Fool or the entire series is about because it's just a bit spoilery. I'm going to go through the reading experience, kind of stylistically, what type of read is it, and then the individual categories. We got character, plot, world building, action, theme, and prose. Any criticisms I have, this section will be pretty short for this series, and my final thoughts. And I'm going to try and be concise, but trying is often step one to failing, as Fitz can tell you. So, the Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy where you will be introduced to Fitz Chivalry Farseer, who starts off the books at the age of 6, and he's arrived in Buckkeep, which is the capital of the Six Duchies, which is kind of a realm, and he is the bastard child of the king-in-waiting, who's the person who's the heir to the throne. And just because of like the culture going on there, this leads to the king-in-waiting basically standing back from the throne, which a lot of people irrationally blame Fitz for, because the person who his father was chivalry, was very, very popular. And so it is largely a character study of this character Fitz, and him growing up in Buckkeep Castle, surrounded by, all the politics and maneuvering going on for this kingdom. It is all of these books are very much focused on relationships, and this especially, it's very focused on Fitz's relationships with various characters, and it's very much non-action packed, which you will hear me say a lot. And Fitz, the world really dumps on Fitz, man. Like Fitz has a rough time. He really has to deal with the loneliness and isolation of being a royal bastard, and then there's another factor that leads to it even more. And yeah, it's a very, very introspective, in Fitz's head story. Kind of in terms of like the storytelling method, it reminds me of Kingkiller, where you have future Fitz telling the story of past Fitz throughout his life, but we spend much less time in the present. Like, it's not like Kingkiller, where you spend quite a bit of time in the present and then even more in the past, but this is more in the past. Yeah, that is Farseer. Obviously, the summary is a pretty small part of this review. And then Liveship moves over. It's the same world, and it's chronologically after. Oh, and the cat has, I think, randomly decided she doesn't want me to hold her anymore. Okay. So it is in a different part of the world. But just kind of like a different area. So it takes place to the south of the Farseer trilogy, and it is third person, which, for those who don't know, this is made up of 5 sub-series, which is 3 trilogies that are first person, and following Fitz, and then a trilogy and a quartet that are third person limited, following a bigger cast of characters. And Liveship introduces you to this bigger cast of characters, and it's centered around the Vestrit family, who is a family that has a live ship that is basically about to come alive. Because how live ships work is, and don't worry, this is like on the back of book 1, I'm not spoiling anything, is when a family when one family has lived and died on a live ship for 3 generations, it quickens, which is basically it comes to life. And this is the person who's the 3rd generation of Vestrit is sick and is dying, so their live ship is about to quicken, and it deals with, the not everything goes well, let's put it that way. And this the first book is primarily a family drama, and then it gets a little bit more kind of magic focused and bigger in the second half of the trilogy. And this is personally my favorite of the trilogies. I think it's brilliant, but that is generally what they're about. And then there definitely is an overarching story for the entire 16 books, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's kind of happening behind the scenes very early on, and then it gets revealed slowly, the curtains are drawn back near the end of the series, and it's one reason I'm very, very, very much looking forward to rereading this series, which is probably going to happen in 2022. But let's move on to the reading experience. So, what is it like to read Realm of the Elderlings? And the first thing to mention is, really all of the books tend to be very character-driven, slow books. The conflict is based on conflict of wills, and between characters, the conflict is very rarely, well, this group wants to murder this group, and this group wants to murder this group, so we're going to see who's better at murdering each other, and then that'll decide how the book goes. That's very, very, very rare. It's not never, but it's very, very rare. And I think one thing that kind of shows how it really just Hobb doesn't think action is the point is there is a battle, small battle, in Liveship that literally gets faded to black. Because I guess Hobb just thinks that isn't the point. It's like the way some authors will fade to black for a sex scene if it isn't going to change anything. Hobb kind of, I'm assuming, looked at that action scene, was like, nothing that's important to the story happens in this action scene. There are no real long-term consequences in it, so we're just going to not have it. And that's kind of, I think, her attitude around action. There is some action, but it's not very much. It's a lot more based on, as I said, conflict of wills. And the other thing to note is the way Hobb tells, especially Fitz's story, is it's very much day by day. The normal problems of life do not get glossed over. So Fitz will tell you, what he had for breakfast. Like, it'll be mentioned. He's not going to spend, 2 pages talking about what he had for breakfast, but it's something that's worth noting is that kind of them living in the world feels very grounded because, you don't skip over those things. Those things are in there. And it ends up coming almost always down to character decisions. And I think Hobb has said she outlines really short books, and then her characters don't follow her outline, and they really make everything go to crap, and then she gets long books. And that's how she ends up with long books. And it really is true. Conflict is virtually exclusively driven by character decisions. You basically never have the situation of, oh, what's going on? We don't know what's going to happen. Oh no, someone just showed up and tried to kill us. It's almost always based on character decisions. People say it's very character driven, and that is true. And also, in terms of writing style, it is definitely high prose, and she's arguably my favorite prose writer, but it's pretty digestible. It's more trying to be elegant than trying to be, super grandiose, and it very much succeeds at that. It's some of the most elegant writing I've read. And also, for these stories, you will mostly follow good people. And that's partially because you spend the majority of the time following Fitz, and while Fitz is a very flawed character, he is not a bad person. He's one of the good guys. Liveship and Rainwilds, on the other hand, since they follow, you have point of views from a large cast of characters, you follow people who are clearly good and people who are clearly evil, and kind of everything in between. It's one reason I think I like Liveship. You really see the whole spectrum of morality all in different point of views. Even though Fitz is my favorite character ever, I do really appreciate the variety. One thing I really like about this series that I think makes it less intimidating is that it's split into sub-series, and I am calling it one series, The Realm of the Elderlings, because I do kind of consider it one series, but each series, if you just read Farseer could have been published as just its own series. Hobb almost could have stopped writing this series after Farseer, after Liveship, after Tawny Man, maybe even after Rainwilds, or after Fitz and Fool. You can stop and take a big break after any of them. You're never gonna get an end to a sub-series that is anything resembling a cliffhanger. So you don't need to, you can take breaks between them. I took a pretty big break between Farseer and Liveship, because I kind of read Farseer, okay, trying to figure out whether I would like Hobb, and then, after I read Farseer, I ordered the rest of the series, but then I took a pretty big break, and there were no problems for doing that. I didn't need to have to go reread Farseer or anything, and so that worked out really well. And I kind of like how after the end of each series, it feels like it could be, almost a final ending, and then you read the next series, and you're kind of like, oh yeah, all that needs to happen, damn. So I'm very much a fan of the way that's done. And I would say Hobb, one reason she's extremely good at maintaining tension, she has the reputation for being willing to hurt her characters, and things go very poorly a lot. So a lot of the time I say, some of her books, some aspects will almost be slightly predictable, but they're predictable in the way of, I'm predicting things are going to go horribly constantly, so it actually just builds tension. And I do want to say, I don't actually think Hobb is more, frequently brutal to her characters. I just think when she hurts her characters, she's better at it, so it hurts us more. That's my theory behind it, and I'm sticking to it. But that's kind of some things I want to outline about what it's like to read the series. So we are now going to move over to the different categories, which I'm going to start with characters, which is the most important category. But we're moving on because this video is probably going to be too long. So I am going to preface the characters section by just leading with Robin Hobb is, as far as I'm concerned, the best character writer in the genre by far. Like, it's not even, at least for, like, who I think is the best character writer, not even a little bit close. I don't know who second is. Before reading this, I struggled to pick my favorite character writer. There were kind of a few, but now it's not even close. Hobb by a mile. She has some of the most complex and multifaceted characters. I say a lot of time, like, when I'm reading a book, there's kind of two things that make me enjoy the book for characters. You can have characters that are interesting or characters that I'm invested in, and they're kind of different. Like, there are characters who I don't think are that interesting, but I very much care what happens to them, and they're vice versa. Hobb is one of the few writers who really nails both. And on the other hand, there's authors who get you instantly invested in characters, and authors who get you the most invested in characters. So for me, the two contrasts for this is John Gwynne gets me invested in characters right away. Like, first chapter of their point of view, I'm invested in you. Robert Jordan, on the other hand, does not. But Robert Jordan, on the other hand, has much higher, like, maximum levels invested. Like, once I do get invested in the characters, I'm really invested in the characters. Again, Hobb is both. Maybe not so much. The only exception, funnily enough, is Fitz, who took a little bit to grow on me, partially just because he starts the series as a 6-year-old. But after that, I basically, especially with Liveship, Tawny Man, and Fitz of the Fool, like, I was just instantly invested in the characters, and they hit the highest peak level of investment. I don't know how she does it. I mean, I guess there's no real reason, like, an author shouldn't be able to do both, but I don't think I've run into an author that does either as well as she does. And not only do her characters start interesting, like, they always have, like, a distinct voice, and you get to know them super fast. Their character development is always insanely amazing. It's one thing I talked about in my, a specific thing I talked about for Liveship was, like, how characters' priorities change throughout the books. And I can't talk about that in any specifics, but she very much doesn't rely on, like, epiphanies or moments of characters, like, having big changes. It's, like, they just gradually grow as people. Like, their priorities change, how they think changes, their morals change. It's so well done. I think the best example of this is Wintrow's arc in Ship of Magic. His change, like, throughout that book. He's not, like, gonna think about, like, have a change in his morality and, like, go somewhere else. It's just who he is gradually and naturally evolves. And yeah, it's out of this world. Also, I think as much as, like, characters themselves are her strengths, her relationship writing is arguably even farther ahead of other authors. One thing I think she does, like, maybe for normal relationships, like, best friends, there are some people who I could be like, okay, you can compete with Hobb, but it's really unique relationships, like the Fitz and the Fool, or Brashen and Paragon, which, the Fitz and the Fool is hard to explain, but Brashen is a person and a slightly insane boat. And her ability to make those relationships feel real, despite the fact that, like, no one has any experience with a relationship between a guy and a slightly insane boat. So I don't know how I know that it's right, but I can tell when I read it that it's just, I guess correct is the wrong word, because it's like a book, but it's true. And her mastery of, like, dialogue and how people would talk to in these various relationships, because people talk differently to, like, different types of people. Like, you talk differently to your boss, or to your parents, or to your best friend, or to someone you just met. And Hobb is able to capture how people would talk to a slightly insane boat who is attached to them, but also slightly judgmental of their choices, which I don't know how, but she does it. And those are just two that I picked, but the amount of, like, unique relationships in this series is totally insane. And on that note, that kind of comes over. It's part of that she's the best dialogue writer I've read, specifically for this factor. I think there are some authors who are kind of write more snappy dialogue. Like Abercrombie, for example, I think writes more kind of snappy dialogue. Same with maybe Butcher or Scott Lynch. But none of them are as good at having the dialogue show things about their characters and their relationships, which is why she is my pick for the top dialogue writer. She also, her dialogue is always elegant. There's no like clunky or cringy dialogue. Those other three authors I said also don't tend to have clunky dialogue, but Hobb I think has the most elegant dialogue and the best at showing character relationships. Not quite like the snappiest, but I mean, good in that respect, just not like literally the best I've read. And the other aspect of characterization that, again, I think she's very, very good at is at character voice for internal monologues. Funnily enough, you aren't going to know she's good at this until you read Ship of Magic, because the first trilogy is all from Fitz's point of view. And then where it really stands out is when you switch back to Fitz in Tawny Man and realize how distinctive Fitz's voice is, which, I mean, when I first read Farseer, I assumed that was just Hobb's voice. The same thing happened to me for Dresden and Alara, where I go from Harry Dresden to Codex Alera and then back to Dresden, and I'm like, holy crap, that's not Butcher, that's Dresden. It's the same for this. That's not Hobb, that's Fitz. So she would be one of the two people I would consider the best voice writers, up there with Abercrombie. I'd probably pick Abercrombie with that. And one other thing Hobb has going for her especially is, this is another one that we've had a couple in here that she's kind of like, among my favorites, but by far the most hateable villains ever. Like, oh my... They're, like, just not even close. Her hateable villains are just... They're the most hateable by such a huge amount. And she also has very, like, nuanced villains, and for Liveship, what I consider to be the best antagonist in the genre, who's, like, one of the most complex characters I've ever read. But also, at the same time, just being able to make you absolutely want to murder someone. Anyway, we're moving on. And one thing I do have to warn you for her characters is 100% of Robin Hobb characters will make foolish decisions. All of them, there are no exceptions. They are always in character foolish decisions. Because as I said, she outlines short books, and then her characters don't follow her outline, so they complicate things for herself, because she's like, in her outline, all the characters, I guess, make, like, logical decisions, and then she gets to that part in the book, and it's like, Fitz isn't that smart. Not Fitz specifically, they're all dumbasses, but, I mean, people are dumbasses, and it's very easy while reading, while having way more information, to be like, that's a bad decision, but I think of, like, the decisions I make at home, and there are some decisions that if I read a character in a book making the decisions I make, I'd be like, that's so stupid. Like, you can all tell me if you've ever done this, where you have some schoolwork you have to do, and you have work the next day and no work today, but instead of doing the schoolwork that day, you're like, I'll do it after work the next day, just because I procrastinated it. And it's like, that's totally dumb. There's no justification for it. It's completely illogical. And yet, so many people do that. And her characters do the same type of thing. But that's what I gotta say for Hobb characterization. It's the primary reason I love this series so much. As much as I think she might also be one of my favorite prose writer, and she's also good at other stuff, this is really what puts her ahead of basically everyone else. And it is that she is easily my pick for the best character writer in the genre, and I know I'm not alone in thinking that. So we have gotten through the character section, and now it is time for the everything else section. We got prose, we got plotting, we got world building, we got themes, and we got action. And so, first off is prose, which is kind of her other biggest strength relative to other people. Unlike characters, it's not the thing I care the most about while reading. So it still contributes to her being my favorite author, probably. Not probably. It still contributes to her being my favorite author, but not as much as characters. It's basically a two-horse race for me for favorite prose writer, and it's with her and Guy Gavriel Kay. Her writing, I think, is the most elegant I have read. There is not an awkward sentence in the 4.1 million words. You can look for one, you won't find one, it's not there. It's just, everything is so elegant, and despite being kind of like fancy or flowery prose, it's super readable. I do think Assassin's Apprentice, like book 1, was probably about as flowery as other books, but I think she got much better at being more readable and clear over time. And I think she did without sacrificing the beauty and elegance of her prose. So for basically the entirety of the series, I mean, I think even Assassin's Apprentice is very, very well written, but she does improve over time for prose. But it manages to be, like, not overly dense and very, very digestible, while also absolutely being the type of writer where you will pause at sentences and be like, wow, like, the way that was put together was so good. And next we move to plotting, which, unlike character and prose, is not Hobb's biggest strength. Especially pacing. Some of her books are well-paced, whether they're like a well-paced slow burn, or some are a little bit faster. Some of her books are just not well-paced. Like, the pacing of Dragon Keeper, or really, and Dragon Keeper, and Dragon Haven, and Assassin's Quest, are all a mess. And I love the writer, but they're just not paced well. And it's not even that they're slow pacing. All the books are slow pacing. Like, Ship of Magic has very slow pacing, but I think it's an example of good slow pacing. Some of her books are just badly paced. Like, there's just, like, a ton happens early, and then it just spins its wheels, and you don't feel like you're making progress, and you're like, what is going on? And then a bunch happens, and it's not great. Nah, it's just true. And also, especially in Farseer, I think she's not amazing at setup and payoff. Like, it's not like you get, I think my favorite, like, reveals and payoffs are when it gets paid off and the setup becomes obvious in hindsight. There's definitely, like, some payoffs or reveals in Farseer that are kind of just like, okay, cool. That's something she gets much, much better at. I think even the gap there between Farseer and Liveship is huge, where most of the payoffs in Liveship, there really was some where it was like, oh crap, that was really obvious in hindsight, damn. So I think she gets much, much more subtle at setting things up, and much better at setting things up before she pays them off. But in Farseer, that's not the thing she's great at. One thing she does do extremely well for her plotting, especially for the third-person stories, even in Rainwild, this is one of my biggest pros for Rainwild, which is my least favorite subseries, is having events in one point of view affect events and characters, like, really far away in a totally believable and interesting way. Like, the butterfly effect of a character making one decision, then affecting these two characters, which leads to them doing different things, which affects these two characters, and, like, spreads out. Like, the consequences of decisions, like, ripple out, like they do through a pond. She does that really, 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 really well. Especially in Liveship. It's probably one of the things I think Liveship does incredibly well. And she even does it really well in Rainwilds. It's why I think one of the things that the Fitz series were never quite able to manage, because they're pretty much, it's like, it's all one perspective. I threw a pretty much in there. You'll have to raffle on that, but it's when it's all from Fitz's perspective, you can't really get that, because you're only following one character. You can kind of get it a little bit because of the way the magic system works, but speaking of which, the magic system and world building. So the magic system in Farseer is one that I think has high highs, but also has some things that annoy me. There's very much the issue in Farseer where some characters seem to be as powerful with the magic as they need to be. For context, the magic, there's two. There's the skill and the wit,
and primarily the skill is telepathy with other humans, while the wit is telepathy with other animals. It's much more complicated than that, but that's good enough. And there are certainly some times in Farseer where it's like, character doesn't need to be able to do magic because the plot. Oh, now he does need to be able to, so he does now. And that kind of annoyed me. But whatever. I will say throughout the series, and so I thought, like, the wit and the skill in Farseer I think is fine. I think it gets better and better realized as that goes on, and I don't think she uses that crutch at all, and it gets much more, like, the consistency in the future trilogies I think is much, much stronger. And one thing it does do is her kind of, like, having the magic system connect with, like, allow her to connect with characters more and lead to character moments is very, very strong. And the way she uses it, not necessarily for, like, problem solving, but for creating emotional moments, and the way it works is very, very strong. Anyways, I should probably talk about other world building aspects. And I think for world building in general, the world building in Realm of the Elderlings is very good. It's not the primary reason you go into Realm of the Elderlings. Like, it has 16 books to work with. Like, so it's almost hard for it to not be good. I will say, even on a book-by-book basis, it does a good job of world building. Except Farseer, really. I think Farseer really just doesn't use its setting that effectively. You could basically set Farseer anywhere, and the story doesn't change that much for most of it. It does kind of have generic castle syndrome. But for Liveship, Tawny Man, Rainwilds, and Fitz and the Fool, the world building, really even on a book-by-book basis, is incredibly strong, where it really feels like a lived-in world. It has very well-written and distinctive cultures. The way the history has been built is very, very interesting. It's kind of got a Wheel of Time type thing going on, except it's like a much more unfortunate type of wheel thing. So people do talk about time being a wheel in here, but unlike the Wheel of Time, where it's over, like, thousands and thousands of years and it's the same things repeat themselves, this is over, like, the wheel is like a couple generations, and it's a wheel that's slowly descending. Like, if you don't do anything, things slowly spiral and get worse and worse, and so you have to actively stop things from slowly spiraling and get worse and worse. So it's got kind of something somewhat similar, which is why there are a couple passages where I'm just like, Wheel of Time. But it's not completely like that, so it is subtly different. And the shorter time span, and the fact that, like, you know, we follow book 1, Fitz is 6. By the end, he's in his 60s. So that's a couple generations. So we do see some things kind of like repeat, and it's not like the Wheel of Time where it's like the exact same events happen. It's more like, in general, like, people in their patterns go over the same pattern, like generations repeat the same mistakes. But yeah, I mean, world building, it's good. It's even very good. It's not, this isn't like the Malazan section of my, or the world building section of my Malazan review, where it's like one of the primary reasons people read Malazan or Wheel of Time or Stormlight is the world building. This is, it's very good, so, but it's more of a bonus. And next up is themes, which I think for themes, they're somewhat out of the way, but also very thought-provoking. So I think Liveship is the strongest thematically, but it's also like, they're very much not thrust upon you. They're kind of, the themes come from you considering what happened and kind of what it has to say about human nature. So I think this is very much, it's not a theme-driven story, like something like Malazan or even the Poppy War would be, where the themes aren't the main point, but the way it delivers the themes is actually the way I prefer, which is very much, I guess, shown, not told, but it's more like they're out of the way and they're there if you look for them, but they never get in the way of other aspects of the characters, which I think sometimes when you have series where the primary goal is to express a theme,
sometimes it gets in the way of the plot or the characters and the world building, and it never does here. It's always those things combine to build the theme, not the primary goal is a theme, and also those things are kind of around it. So especially Liveship, but I think it's very, very strong thematically. It'd be some of the strongest books thematically I've read, especially Liveship, which to me, the main themes of Liveship is complacency and kind of like the status quo almost. And like, anyways, I'll let you read it. But I actually really like the way it handles theme, the way they're there, but they don't get in the way of things. And lastly, action. This is going to be a short part because, as I said in the reading experience, there's very little action. The funny thing is, I actually think Robin Hobb is a good action writer. The action that's there is good. And part of the reason that it's good might not be because actually, like, scene per scene, it's amazing, but because she only includes action scenes when they will have consequences, every action scene is super high stakes. Like, every single action scene is so high stakes because you know that if there weren't going to be consequences to this action scene, it wouldn't be in the book. So you're never going to have an action scene where it's like, oh, there's an action scene and then things move on after. So, yeah. And for that same reason, I mean, like, it's the same thing. Like, so every single action scene, there will either be major character development or major long-term consequences, or both. Usually both. And so I have to give it props for that, but there's very little action. I think, for example, Ship of Magic has probably 2 pages, 3 pages of action. The Fitz books probably average a little bit more action per page because Fitz is more likely to try and solve things with violence than some of the other characters, and usually not particularly successful. But that is the other categories that are not characters, which is mostly strong across the board. Plotting is definitely the weakest link. Of these prose and themes would be the strongest link, and then action is just basically not there. So, this is my final thoughts section. I'm just going to kind of combine this where I kind of say any criticisms I have, although I kind of touched on most of them. Basically just for the plotting of it. As I said, sometimes the pacing is straight up bad. Like, wheels are spun, progress is not made. At that aspect, it's not great. But, despite that, this is still likely my favorite series of all time. Anyone talks to me a lot has known Stormlight has been my favorite series for a long time. It's very, very hard to compare Stormlight to Realm of the Elderlings. They're very, very stylistically different. One is a 16-book completed series. One is a 4-book incomplete series. Stormlight is kind of, I like every aspect of Stormlight, but Realm of the Elderlings, for its best aspects, stands out more, with it just being, as far as I'm concerned, the best series in terms of characters ever. And also standing out for prose and, to a lesser extent, theme. It's very much a series that it's not for everyone because of the pacing. I know a lot of people just don't want to read slow burns consistently. But for this style of story, it is easily the best that I have read. And I think I suspect it will have a lot of overlap with the Song of Ice and Fire fans. This is based on them having stylistic similarities, similar strengths. Plus, I just know, like, it seems like every A Song of Ice and Fire fan who reads them seems to really like them. Talking about you, Jimmy Nuts. Fantasy Network, good channel, good Realm of the Elderlings content and opinions, good stuff. And also, I mean, you know, the two authors themselves, like Hobb and George R. R. Martin, very much like each other's work because of those similarities. And also, one thing that Realm of the Elderlings has over basically every series, especially incomplete series like Stormlight, is it has as close to a perfect ending as I have read. Easily my favorite ending of any series that I've read. Like, it's not close, with the second last chapter, which is like a really long chapter, and then the last chapter is short, but the second last chapter is my favorite chapter in fiction.
It basically ended the way it had to, and was as so good. So it has that kind of over everything. And also, it's a 10-book series of huge books that actually has good romances. So, get wrecked, Malazan and Wheel of Time. It is possible. It's been proven. They said it couldn't be done. Because there's 3 series that are like 4 million words. And the other 2, Malazan and Wheel of Time, just don't have good romances. Sorry, Malazan and Wheel of Time fans. Look into your heart. You know it to be true. Realm of the Elderlings does. And I basically think if you're a character-driven reader, you are doing yourself a major disservice if you don't read Realm of the Elderlings. Or plan to read Realm of the Elderlings. If you're not a character-driven reader, then don't read it. But if you are, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you aren't reading these. That's all I got. So that's all I would say. I think I actually kept this somewhat reasonably not 2 hours long. So I'm really proud of myself for not making this a 2 hour long review, which is that's too long. But hard for me to be more positive on this series. It might be my favorite series ever. So that's all I got. I still do not have a send-off.